First, a quick disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a policy expert, and I don't work for any part of the government. I'm a convicted felon. I can't even vote. I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, and I could talk all day about my own views, but that's not what this is about. This video is for you, the people who can vote, who can show up, and who can actually move the needle. I don't care about playing team sports with politics. I care about having a community where I can raise my daughter in peace and stay out of the way. And that's my piece of the American dream. And no matter who you are, if you live here, these laws can affect your life in a big way. And I'm not here to tell you what to think or to predict the future. I'm here to lay out the information as clearly as I can so you can look at it and think for yourself and make your own decisions. So, welcome to this very special episode of Fed by Fire, where we get real about what's going on in the world. But today we're talking about Virginia. I'm Christian Whitlow, and I'm coming to you from my city, Roanoke, and tonight we're stepping into something I usually wouldn't, something personal to me, some of the heaviest issues hitting our state, and we're talking about the hate crime laws and how we define Islamophobia, and we're talking about the new gun control bills, and we're talking about the sentencing changes for violent crimes. We're also going to be talking about the governor's new immigration move that just pulled Virginia out of a federal program with ICE. And on top of that, we're going to be talking about a new tax plan that wants a piece of your Amazon, your Netflix, and other streaming subscriptions. And these aren't just headlines out of the news. These are laws and directives that can touch your freedom, your safety, and your wallet, and your sense of justice, and how much you trust the people running this place. So if you're new here, this is not a show where we just scream and show talking points. We look at the facts and we listen to every side, and I'm not going to lie to you. You will hear my passion when I see human beings getting caught in the crossfire of politics, and that's the fire that feeds this show. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe, drop a like. You can follow me on X or TikTok in the description. Those will be down there so you don't miss any of my deep dives. And just thanks for being here and thanks for listening. And especially, if you're here with me in Virginia and seeing this stuff up close. So take a breath, settle in, because we're going to be here for a second talking about what our lawmakers and our governor are doing and what it means for regular people like you and me. So let's start with something that sounds simple on paper but gets real messy in the real world. How Virginia wants to define Islamophobia in our hate crime laws. So Senate Bill 624, SB 624, is a bill in the Virginia General Assembly that deals with assault and battery, but as a specific definition for Islamophobia. And the bill defines Islamophobia as malicious prejudice or hatred directed toward Islam or Muslims. And it ties that definition into how the state tracks and classifies bias-motivated offenses in plain language. If somebody commits an assault that's motivated by hatred towards Muslims or even towards Islam as a religion, that gets flagged as Islamophobia in the hate crime reporting system. And now on the surface, you hear that and think, okay, so they're just trying to protect Muslims from hate crimes. That's good, right? What's the big deal? But there are two big tensions here. One is Virginia already has crime laws that enhance penalties when somebody targets a victim because of religion, race, or other protected categories. And, Muslims are already covered under religious conviction. And two, this bill doesn't just focus on hate against people who are Muslim, it explicitly names Islam as a religion in the definition, which has some folks worried, that we're drifting into like policing criticism of a belief system instead of protecting human beings from violence. And supporters of SB 624 say, look, hate crimes are up and there's real fear in Muslim communities, and we need better tools to track and respond to bias. And they point to data showing hate crime reporting climbing and see this as a corrective move. But, they're not wrong that anti-Muslim bias does exist. Families get targeted, mosques get vandalized, and kids hear slurs in school, and that's real pain, and the law should not be blind to that whatsoever. But critics, including, free speech advocates and some religious liberty groups, are sounding the alarms, and they argue that this bill risks turning a vague idea of Islamophobia into a kind of secular blasphemy law where criticizing Islamic doctrine or Sharia could be treated as, suspect. If something later happens, they point out that, when you write prejudice towards Islam as a religion into law, you're not just protecting people, you're placing one belief system in a special legal category and inviting future fights over what counts as malicious prejudice versus honest disagreement. And here's, where a little bit of my outrage starts to build, not because I want, Muslims to be unprotected, absolutely, but because we're watching a pattern where instead of enforcing laws that we already have, lawmakers keep adding layered, vague categories that can scare people away from open conversation. And we need spaces where we can talk honestly about religion, extremism, culture, integration, all of it, without people feeling like one wrong phase could get them labeled a bigot in some database. And I think about, a place like Roanoke, we've got neighbors from all different backgrounds, different faiths. You want a town where a Muslim family feels safe walking at night, no question. But you also want a town where people can argue beliefs, challenge ideas, and speak freely about what they're seeing, whether, that's radicalization on overseas or integration issues. Right here at home, safety and free speech are not enemies, but a clumsy law can make them sure feel like they are. And remember, once a term like Islamophobia is formally defined in state law and embedded in reporting systems, it doesn't just stay in Virginia. If this goes through, it can become a model for other states, experimenting with speech adjacent categories wrapped in hate crime language. And that's the bigger trend, I'm watching. The slow creep of speech norms into criminal categories, just like they're dealing with in England. So I want to hear from you on this one. Do you believe that SB 624 is a necessary update to protect Muslim communities from supposedly rising hate? Or do you think this definition crosses a line and risks chilling, honest, even uncomfortable debates about Islam and related issues? So do me a favor, drop a comment. I'd love to hear your opinion, especially if you're in the state with me, because here Your voice matters. But alright, take a quick mental break. We're switching lanes. And, here in a minute. But think about how you balance protection and free speech when we're going through this. We'll see what happens. Alright, next we're going to be talking about the new gun control pushes, aka HB 2117. And let's talk about the gun, specifically House Bill 2117, Senate Bill 749. These bills are pushing new restrictions on what they call assault firearms and larger capacity magazines. And here in Virginia, to put it simply, both bills are aimed at cutting off the future flow of certain rifles and limiting magazines that hold more than a set number of 10 rounds, with some differences in exact numbers and categories. One gun rights group, summarized it this way: under these bills, you can keep the so-called assault-style firearms that you already own, but you can't buy new ones, and you can't sell the ones you have inside of Virginia. And once the law takes effect for magazines, HB 217 would let you keep magazines over 10 rounds that you already own, but would ban buying or selling new ones after a cutoff date. And SB 749 in some versions has been even harsher, threatening, magazines over 10 rounds as contributed to grandfathering. There's also confusion, and some versions have suggested a 15 round limit and carve outs, and people are just struggling to keep up with what's in which draft. And supporters of these bills bring up mass shootings, school tragedies, and cases where shooters used multiple magazines over 10 rounds to maximize damage. But if you want a gun, you're going to get a gun. That's just what it is. They argue limiting capacity and the availability of these rifles can reduce the body count when something horrible happens. I don't agree with that, but they'll say if we can make even one attacker reload more often, that's a chance for someone to escape or fight back. And critics, I hear from a lot of them, in this audience, and they see something very different. They see lawmakers treating standard capacity magazines as if they're exotic war tools, even though millions of law-abiding citizens use 11, 15, 17, or even 30 round mags as the default for self-defense and sport. So they point out that these magazines and these rifles are in common use, not fringe weapons. So let me be real with you. My passion here is not about the duty and the right, it's about the right to protect your family. And when a bill says you can keep what you have, but we're cutting off future options and maybe even, treating some of your gear as contraband, that sounds like a slow squeeze, not a compromise. And, they're doing this while we're still failing hard on other issues like mental health, repeat offenders, and early intervention. And the stuff everyone admits plays a huge role in gun violence. In a place like Roanoke, your ability to defend your home isn't, theoretical. You might live in a neighborhood where police response times are slow, or where you've already seen violence time and time again. And if someone kicks your door in at 3 a.m., that, arbitrary 10 round number doesn't care if there's one intruder or three. It doesn't care if you're disabled, outnumbered, or panicked. And I'm not saying that there's zero room for any regulation ever. I'm saying that it's outrageous when lawmakers keep choosing the symbolic restriction that looks good on a campaign flyer instead of doing the hard, messy work of addressing root causes and enforcing laws that we already have against violent criminals and taking tools away from regular people who follow the rules. While, criminals, they're going to get weapons whether they want to or not. Rather, if you want one, they're going to get one. So, let me ask you this. Do you feel safer in Virginia where the state is actively working to phase out, common self-defense tools, or in a Virginia where good people stay fully equipped and the real hammer drops on those who abuse those tools? Tell me in the comments. I'd love it. What does protection mean to you? Is it about fewer guns in general, or is it about the right to people being armed and trained? So, alright, take a breath, stretch, grab some water, do what you're gonna do. Do what you gotta do. And next, we're gonna be digging into something that cuts into the core of justice. Sentencing charges for serious crimes where mercy meets consequences, and sometimes where victims get left behind. And next up, sentencing. This is where the law stops being abstract and becomes years and decades, sometimes lifetimes of somebody's reality. This law, HB 863 and HB 853, were proposals aimed at eliminating or relaxing mandatory minimums for sentences for a long list of offenses, over 200 crimes, including manslaughter, certain sexual assaults, and some offenses involving children. And these bills, stalled in early February, but the debate they sparked isn't going away. The argument for these bills goes like this. Mandatory minimums tie judges' hands and pack prisons with people who might deserve a second chance. I'm a second chance. I'm a walking one, and it doesn't always fit the details of a case. And reformers say that we need flexibility, room for judges to weigh context, trauma, mental health, and rehabilitation on, potential. And they point to stories where someone, with no prior record gets slammed with, the same minimum as a hardened predator because the statute doesn't allow nuance on the other side. Victims, advocates, and tough on crime voices say, hold up. We put those minimums in place for a reason. And, they worry about that gutting mandatory minimums for crimes like rape or child exploitation sends some type of message that the system is drifting back towards soft sentences on things we really shouldn't have soft sentences for, and backroom deals. And when you've been assaulted or lost someone to violence, it's not a game, and the last thing you want is to watch the person who did it walk out early because a judge decided that the minimum was just too harsh. And I know what it's like to live around the criminal justice world and see how different people get treated differently, and to feel that tension between wanting mercy and wanting safety. But when it comes to these crimes, I have no fucking empathy. I'm a dad first, and you can look at my jacket, there's no weird shit like that on there, and that's where I stand with that. Moving on. There's a lot of cases, though, that, somebody else with money or connection could skate, and the mercy versus the justice question isn't clean. It's outrage territory, and when we pretend it is, when you erase mandatory minimums for serious violent crimes without, strong safeguards, you risk chaos in sentencing, and one judge goes light, another goes heavy, and victims in different counties get widely different outcomes for similar harm. And that inconsistency deepens distrust for victims, and it can feel like the system is experimenting with their trauma, and that's not cool at all. And I'm all for redemption. I'm living proof that people can change, but I'm not for redemption that gets handed out so easily. It looks like amnesia. Here's my question for you. How do you balance it? Should serious violent crimes always carry hard minimums, or do you want judges free to go below those if they truly believe that someone is rebuilt? Where's the line between second chances and repeating the same mistakes on the backs of victims? So take a moment with that, because think about it, process it. I'm gonna hit this vape real quick. Next, we're going to move on to immigration enforcement, a hot topic in this country right now, and what it means for Virginia. On February 3rd, Governor Abigail Spanberger, she signed an executive order plus a directive that changed how Virginia state law enforcement deals with federal immigration enforcement. And the key move that she ordered is Virginia state agencies, the state police department, the Department of Corrections, conservation police, and marine police to terminate all existing agreements under a federal program called 287G, the program that lets local or state officers work under ICE's authority to help enforce civil immigration laws, things like visa overstays or unauthorized presence, not just criminal charges. And Spanberger's message was that these agreements had, improperly ceded discrimination and authority over Virginia law enforcement to federal immigration officials. She says that she wants state officers focused on enforcing Virginia law and going after actual criminal conduct, not acting as frontline immigration agents. And she also laid out, policing principles that emphasized, what she calls fear-based policing and enforcement, theater in favor of building community trust so people aren't scared to call for help. But supporters of this move say, good, we don't want to call the cops seen as ICE in local uniform, and they argue that undocumented victims or witnesses think any interaction with state police might get them funneled into ICE, and they stay silent because of that, which makes everybody just a little less safe. Ending 287G for state agencies, they say, makes it more likely that immigrants will report crimes and show up as witnesses and work with law enforcement in general. And they also point out that the state still honors criminal warrants and court orders, and this isn't a full sanctuary law where Virginia refuses to cooperate on serious criminals. Critics see something very different though, a slow walk towards a sanctuary state. But that's the behavior that they warn this type of law is pulling us towards. And it sends a signal that civil immigration enforcement is now ICE's problem alone, which could mean fewer touch points where people here unlawfully get flagged before they commit more serious crimes. Some worry that gang members, traffickers, or repeat offenders slip through the cracks. When cooperation gets scaled back, especially in future policies, further limit ICE's access in jails, schools, or courthouses. And to be clear, this order doesn't make Virginia a textbook sanctuary state, so there's no blanket ban on sharing information with ICE, and criminal warrants are still honored. But you can see, the direction of the shift away from state-led civil immigration enforcement and toward a model where, state officers stay in their lane and ICE handles its own priorities. That direction was, real implications for safety and trust, and that's where, my outrage locks in. If we don't keep the balance right, on one hand, I get the trust argument. If you've got an undocumented mom who just, watched her kid get assaulted and you want her to call the police without fear of reporting that crime, becomes a one-way ticket out of the country, and I fully understand that. And that silence is what helps predators prey on people. And on the other hand, you've got hardworking Virginians watching headlines about cartel-linked trafficking, gang violence, and repeat offenders. And, they're asking why are we making it harder to cooperate with federal agents whose entire job is immigration enforcement? So, my fear is this. When decisions like this get framed as compassion versus cruelty, we scratch the surface and ignore the deeper question. How do we blend compassion with real, concrete safety? If ending 287G for state agency leads to more trust and more reporting, that's one thing. If it leads to less cooperation, weaker information sharing, and more blind spots, where dangerous people hide in plain sight, that's something else entirely. Now, before we close, let's talk about money. Money. While all this is happening, there's also talk about taxing your digital life. There's no push for a tax plan that would, hit big streaming and online service companies. Think Amazon, Netflix, and similar platforms. And in reality, that means hitting you as the customer. The idea is sold as making big tech pay their fair share, but you and I both know how this works. Those companies, they don't just eat the cost, they pass it down in higher monthly bills, new fees, and adjustments to your subscription price. So now, on top of inflation, on top of gas, on top of groceries, the state wants a slice of the little bit of entertainment and convenience that you pay for just to unwind after work. And they'll dress it up as tax on corporations, but the charge slides quietly onto your card statement, and it's one more way the average Virginian gets squeezed. Not the lobbyist, not the big donor, not the consultant, but the person sitting on the couch. And after a long day trying to watch a movie with their kid, their wife, my outrage is here. It isn't because Amazon or Netflix are saints. They're not. It's because every time that governments overspends or wants a new program, the solution always seems to end up on the backs of regular people like you and me through one more fee or one more tax or one more surcharge shoved into the fine print. So when you hear the tax on streamers, listen carefully and ask yourself, is this really about making billion-dollar companies hurt, or is this about quietly dipping into my bank account, your bank account? So one more time. So I want your honest take. Do you think that Spanberger's immigration directive and her appetite for new taxes like this streaming tax plan are steps towards a fair, more compassionate Virginia, or are they pieces of a pattern where government grows, your control shrinks, and your bill just keeps going up. Comment your thoughts below, especially if you're already feeling the weight of every little increase on your monthly expenses. We've covered a lot tonight. The hate crime bill that tries to define Islamophobia and, might either protect vulnerable communities or chill free speech. Gun bills that might either reduce violence or strip ordinary Virginians of the tools they rely on to protect their families and stay safe. Sentencing changes that tug of war, mercy, and justice. An immigration directive that might build trust or erode cooperation, and now a tax push that reaches right into your streaming accounts and your living room. So, these aren't just policy debates to me. These are fault lines, cracks that run through neighborhoods like mine and yours. Where real people live with consequences of what gets signed in Richmond. And my outrage isn't just about Spanberger did this or the legislature did that. It's about how often the human being in the middle, the victim, the worker, the parent, the kid, trying to grow up safe, gets treated like a talking point or a pawn instead of the reason these laws exist in the first place. You and I may not agree on every policy, and that's fine. But if we can agree that human life, freedom, and real justice matter more than party wins, then there's still a fire worth feeding. And if this episode hit you, do me a favor and share it with somebody that it could, affect their life, or somebody, that just needs to hear it. We'll be covering a couple more deep dives this weekend. We're gonna be doing one on the Poison for Profit video about the homeless industrial complex. And I got a special Valentine's Day episode I'm going to be filming tomorrow. As always, thank you guys for watching. Love y'all. Peace.